I'd like to move on to our Would You Rather segment. Actually, it's going to be a bit different because of your unique experiences. I'm going to be asking you industry specific ones. Okay, so which industry has more untapped potential in loyalty?
Oh,
Fashion versus streaming.
streaming probably has a lot of untapped potential. So having worked in streaming, and I guess the streaming platform I worked on was quite unusual in that it was for sport, and in particular sort of live sport. The thing about sport is it's kind of seasonal. So we had a bit of a churn issue at the end of a sports season. So that sort of offering value when you don't have the thing that people come to you for to offer is a really interesting conundrum. But I think it does stretch beyond that. You think anything that's a subscription or a sort of membership business, people will come to you for your core offering, but there are definitely levers that you can pull to try and deliver value beyond your core offering that is, gives an incentive for people to stay. So I found that a really interesting one to work on.
Yeah, I think that overlaps with just sports in general. Fan engagement, fan loyalty is its own beast as well.
Because people are always, endemically loyal to their favourite team or player. So people always sort of thought, well, it's the one area you don't need loyalty because people are loyal just by default. But actually, I think there's been that recognition in the loyalty industry, and it's now sort of come across into areas like sport as well, and the sort of fandom more generally, is being able to monetize a loyal base, monetize the data that you can collect from people through their kind of engagement with you as a business. So I think that's a kind of interesting area that's sort of developed in more recent years. And some do better than others in terms of like what they give in return. But I think because of the loyalty to the business, be it the team or whatever, you also have a very high value perception around the sorts of things that you can do to reward. There are many non-monetary things like access and sort of exclusivity that you can do when you are in that kind of privileged position of being, a sports team that someone has supported their whole life and is a big part of their passion. So it's a really interesting area for loyalty to be kind of developing.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about who actually owns that loyalty relationship, is it the team or is it the thing that's hosting whatever it is, whether it's
Yeah.
streaming or club or yeah.
And I mean, in a similar vein, I remember sort of having this conversation with one of the food delivery apps around like, are people loyal to the app or are they loyal to the place that they're ordering from through the app? But then also a lot of them are sort of also offering within that, either sort of connecting to loyalty programs of the brands themselves that are, being purchased through them, those sort of native programs of the brands, or I've seen them also doing kind of like frequency stamp cards, of a certain number of, a reward when you get a certain number of orders with a particular restaurant, for example, who might be an independent restaurant who don't have a program themselves. It's not a big chain, but it's sort of loyalty within loyalty and sort of loyalty to, is it the platform, as you say, is it the place that they're getting the thing from, or is it, the provider of what it is that they're buying? And those aren't always necessarily the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. So which industry do you think is better at using data smartly?
I think we'd probably have to point to grocery here, just because, grocery is an area where a lot of loyalty with the end goal of insights and data, that's kind of where a lot of that developed, and a lot of the kind of, poster children of that kind of practice really started off. So I think grocery is privileged in that you have, first of all, frequency, and second of all, such a variety of different data points because people are purchasing lots of different things that you can learn a lot more about a customer than if you have, an industry like travel where people might only purchase once a year. And the inferences that you can make from that one purchase or one interaction might be limited. So, I think grocery is privileged in that respect. And particularly, I think since, many sort of grocery brands have expanded their offering into, clothing and GM and so on, it means, that the sort of breadth of offering means they can get, more information about that customer profile. And I suppose somewhere like Amazon is sort of similar again, in that you have like a breadth of offering, which means you can start to kind of make inferences and understand the customer by having more and more varied data points. Grocery action it generally very well. They provide lots of highly relevant offers and kind of really leverage the depth and breadth of data that they have. Whereas I think somewhere like Amazon, often you look at some of the the recommendations and things that you get and you think, that's the sort of brand that I would perhaps expect something a little bit more targeted and more relevant from, given the amount of information that they might have about me.
Yeah. I mean, there's great examples for grocery. You've got the Tesco Club Card, you've got the Nectar Points, you've got so many that are just leading the way in loyalty programs in general, not just in that industry. I'm really interested in this next question, what you're going to say. Which industry talks about loyalty the most, but acts on it the least?
I would say airlines. Now, maybe that's my personal
Okay.
experience, and I have to probably caveat this with the fact that I do not have elite status in any of the airlines. I'm not enough of a frequent or high cabin class traveller. So perhaps if I was spending a lot more money with them, I would be experiencing and feeling perhaps more. And obviously it will vary, not all airlines are the same, but certainly I think there is a lot of experience that I either have had or kind of hear of anecdotally, where I think a lot of airlines lead with their frequent flyer program and will talk about, that as a sort of real strong point of their business. And yet the combination, I mean, we talked about like British Airways and that changing of the mechanics of the program, but I think also just generally speaking, it often doesn't feel perhaps like, one is getting very rewarded. Things like earning lots of points, but then not being allowed to spend them on the flight that you want. No, there are too many restrictions on, there was only one seat available on that flight that could be redeemed for points, or, the varying values of different things that make it kind of less easy to understand what you need to do in order to kind of get that reward and have that as a bit more guaranteed. So I think there are a lot of practices in airlines that don't necessarily make it feel terribly rewarding, given what one is spending with them, and yet they often do lead with that kind of messaging as being a core part of their business.
And given as well the high emotional state that customers are in when they are traveling or at the airport, I think there could definitely be more opportunity there for airlines to sort of grab. Yeah. Okay, who has the most pressure to perform on loyalty?
I do think that travel, so not only airline, but travel generally, I think
Hospitality
has
as well.
a lot of pressure. I think because the spend is so high, because it's such a high ticket item, I think the expectation of customers, like, I'm spending lots of money with you, I want to be, recognised and rewarded because, what they're spending is a lot. I think that puts a lot of pressure, and whether that's airlines, whether it's hotels, whether it's OTAs. I ran a program at Expedia for a few years, and what's tricky about that is being an OTA, you don't have control over the end experience. You can, to a point, try and influence certain experiential parts of the journey. So certain airline or hotel chains you might have agreements with to, whether it's upgrades or whether it's kind of certain room types and things like that. And often it's more around the sort of product and inventory management itself rather than loyalty. But to try and kind of impact and elevate a loyalty experience when you aren't delivering the end experience is really difficult. And obviously all of those hotels and airlines have many other partners and D2C customers that they're also trying to deliver on, and so to have a sort of bespoke experience is difficult. Often your systems won't be integrated, so they can't necessarily always see if this is a loyal customer when they're checking in at a particular hotel. They might be a top tier customer with the OTA they book through, but because the customer isn't a direct customer of the brand who's delivering the experience, whether it's just logistics of scale, whether it's things like not actually having access to the data, it makes it much more complex.
Right. Okay. So if you could choose an industry who is most likely to forget the human element, what would you say?
Financial services. is an area that sort of has traditionally, not been associated, let's say, with loyalty and rewarding loyalty. It's usually a very functional kind of purchase, and I think probably bleeds a little bit into sort of utilities as well, kind of telco and utilities. I think those kind of necessary spend kind of purchase cycles, and that sort of every year you've got to renegotiate or change or shop around for another deal every year. But when it comes to things like sort of credit cards and bank accounts and stuff, you've always got some sort of introductory piece that then, if you don't want to get left out in the wasteland, you've got to keep shopping around and moving around. It disincentivizes loyalty as an industry often, because there often are incentives to switch, and usually sort of tenure and loyalty are not rewarded. I think that's an area that loyalty has been very challenging, and I think it's more around the overall landscape, and partly it's forces greater than all of us, but partly it is the industry itself that has kind of developed and made endemic this sort of first year for less, for a discount, and put your premiums up after a year, or incentives to switch, or being put on the worst tariff the minute your deal runs out, and you've got to sort of shop around and move around. I think a lot of those kind of behaviours have been instilled in customers, and it's the industries themselves that have done that. So now they find themselves in a place where actually it's quite difficult to engender loyalty from customers. It's usually a sort of fairly begrudged purchase in the first place, certainly when it comes to things like utilities. So there's not a lot of emotional engagement in where I keep my money or how I pay for things or where my gas comes from. It's something I've got to spend the money on. And I just want to get it at, the most efficient, way that I can. I think credit cards have done a bit more, and I think Amex has sort of led the way here a bit in sort of trying to make credit cards that, a bit sexier and a bit more sort of associated with loyalty and experience and all of that. And some have tried to sort of replicate that, I think, to varying degrees of success. But when it comes to sort of more everyday financial products like bank accounts and things, there's sort of usually a slightly haphazard bundling of slightly random sort of benefits that may or may not be relevant, and then it perhaps doesn't sort of translate in other ways. Octopus, for example, in the UK have a program, and they are quite sort of creative and a bit more kind of engaging in terms of offering something beyond gas and electricity that, as I say, it's not usually the most exciting or sexy product. So they have got sort of more of a loyalty proposition to try and give a bit more of a human element to it, and sort of start to get people to sort of engage with the brand as opposed to just kind of use it functionally.
Okay, so to wrap up our episode, we've spoken a lot about the shifts that need to happen. But I wanted to ask you what predictions you have for the future of loyalty that you think are going to happen within the next couple of years.
I think probably, it sounds terribly kind of cliched, but probably the AI thing, it gets everywhere. It's probably going to get into loyalty a fair bit as well. I think inevitably you get people that talk about AI even when it's not particularly AI. They just sort of use it as a buzzword. But I think that sort of algorithmically driven sort of procedures, I think, is something in particular where, you have things like, we talked about examples of things like grocery, where you've got huge amounts of data and trying to kind of, I guess, like ingest and convert into actionable kind of insights at scale, lots of data. I think AI is likely to kind of come into force a bit more in those sorts of areas. And I think in sort of analytics pieces and being able to understand things like sort of, impacts of programs and incrementality and stuff like that, I think, that probably will start to get used, as in many other practices and industries. I think that will start to be used more. And I think also in terms of things like recommendations of rewards, I think personalization, we talk about personalization a lot, and in particular in the sort of CRM space, but I think understanding customers and therefore being able to reward them in a way that feels relevant to them, I think a lot of that kind of digesting of data and being able to kind of recommend in a more personal way and sort of start to reward people in a way that feels more relevant and more rewarding to them at scale is always something that's been difficult to do at scale. And I think, some of the tools in this area will probably help to facilitate some more kind of interesting pieces in that area.